You must take comfort in your memories, child.
We were all so shocked by Edmund's sudden passing.
Ambitious people have tried to weaken my marriage, not because it is false, but because it stands between them and profitable theft.
When Corenza Ashford's fiancé was carried out of St. Anne's churchyard and lowered into Virginia earth before the spring mud had dried, half of Williamsburg pitied her, and the other half began quietly calculating what remained of her value. No one said so plainly, of course. In Virginia, cruelty preferred gloves. It arrived through lowered voices, visits shortened by invisible convenience, and the new, careful way women looked at Corenza's face before letting their eyes drift, just for a second too long, to the black fabric at her sleeves. A month earlier, she had been a bride in waiting. Now, she was a woman standing too near a dead man's unfinished obligations, and society had already begun the small, elegant labor of deciding whether grief had lowered her price. The worst of it was that sorrow did not protect a woman from arithmetic. Before the flowers left from Edmund Mercer's funeral had fully withered in the Ashford house, creditors had begun writing in gentler tones than bailiffs, but with much the same intent. Men who had once spoken of future settlements now referred to uncertainties. Women who had once admired Corenza's composure now praised it with a shade too much pleasure, as if they had discovered that quiet suffering was prettier when it happened to someone else. And beneath the mourning, beneath the prayer books and the sympathy calls and the polished lies, something larger was already moving toward her. If you are drawn to stories where grief is mistaken for weakness, where conspiracy hides behind good breeding, and where love must be earned only after dignity learns how to fight, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America. Edmund Mercer had not lived long enough to become her husband, yet he had lived quite long enough to endanger her. During the months of his illness, papers had been signed in haste, notes renewed under soft assurances, and obligations hidden beneath the language of courtship and future settlements. Corenza did not know the full extent of it until the week after the funeral, when her father spread 3 ledgers, 4 unpaid notes, and a letter from a Richmond creditor across the breakfast table, and sat staring at them as if numbers themselves had turned traitor.
"There must be some mistake," her mother whispered.
"There are several," Mr. Ashford said. "The worst of them are mine. The rest belong to the dead." Corenza stood very still, one hand resting on the back of a chair. Their house on Palace Street had already begun to show those tiny injuries by which decline first announces itself. The Turkish carpet in the front room had not been replaced where the moths had won. The silver had gone 2 pieces at a time under various excuses. 2 servants had been dismissed with gratitude that sounded too much like apology. Yet they had preserved appearances well enough that society still spoke of the Ashfords as reduced, not ruined. Ruined, however, was what they were becoming. Edmund had borrowed against an expected marriage portion. He had used Corenza's name in more than one conversation, where gentlemen with clean wigs and dirty habits preferred implication to legality. He had entered a speculative venture in river storage and wartime supply, backed by money he did not possess, and guarantees he had no right to imply would be honored by the Ashford family. When fever took him, his charm went into the ground with him. His debts did not. The cruelest part was not the sums. It was the disgrace. By custom, by gossip, and by the lazy moral arithmetic of the colony, a woman attached to a dead man inherited his shadow whether she had signed the papers or not. Corenza, who had been praised a season ago for her composure, beauty, and gentle breeding, became, in a single fortnight, the lady whose prospects had died inconveniently after compromising her future. Invitations thinned. Visits shortened. Concern grew polished and sharp. Then came the proposal no one called one. Nathaniel Ashworth arrived on a wet, gray afternoon in March, his carriage wheels leaving deep cuts in the street before the Ashford house. He was master of Ashworth Landing, one of the largest river estates south of town, a widower of reputation so severe that people called him cold, when what they truly meant was incorruptible. He was not old, though grief and discipline had carved restraint into his face until younger men looked boyish beside him. Dark hair, touched with a narrow silver at the temples, broad shoulders, a manner so measured it could seem almost merciless until one noticed how rarely he used power carelessly. Corenza had met him only a handful of times. She knew that his late father's death 2 years earlier had not settled the Ashworth succession as neatly as the family pretended. A cousin named Silas Ashworth had begun, since then, to hover around the estate with the patience of a man who hoped law might yet do what affection had failed to grant him. There had also once been a lady, Miss Lavinia Vane, who expected to marry Nathaniel and had not forgiven being disappointed. These facts meant nothing to Corenza until Nathaniel Ashworth was shown into the parlor, accepted no refreshment, and said with grave directness, "I have come to discuss a practical arrangement." Her mother left the room after the first quarter hour under the pretext of a headache. Her father remained only long enough to hear the broad outline before embarrassment drove him to the window and then out the door entirely. At last, Corenza and Nathaniel sat opposite each other, with a tea table between them and rain tapping lightly at the panes. "You are frank, sir," she said. "I find ornament expensive," he replied. It was nearly wit. On another day she might have admired it. He folded his hands. "Your late fiancé involved himself in matters connected, though indirectly, to a disputed line of storage rights and shipping contracts along the James. My father signed one of the earlier papers before his death. The matter has since become useful to my cousin Silas, who would like to prove me inattentive to family obligations and therefore unfit to hold Ashworth Landing without oversight. Your family's distress gives him a way to do it." Corenza kept her face composed. "And how do I fit into this useful design?" "By being attached to Mercer's debt in the public imagination," he said. "If your name falls fully into scandal, Silas gains another witness to Ashworth disorder. If your father is forced into a humiliating sale, land near the river changes hands advantageously. If the Ashfords collapse, several men prosper at once." It was the first time anyone had described her ruin as a machine instead of an accident. Nathaniel continued, "I can prevent the immediate damage. I can satisfy the most pressing claims, shield your father from predatory collection, and remove certain papers from my cousin's use. But if I do so privately, the colony will decide I paid for silence. That would weaken you and not help me." Corenza heard then what he had not yet said. "And if you do so publicly?" He held her gaze. "Then it must be done under the protection of an engagement, followed quickly by marriage." The room did not move. The rain did. She had imagined many forms of disgrace over the previous weeks. This had not been one of them. "You speak," she said after a moment, "as if marriage were a legal instrument." "Often it is." "And love?" Something unreadable crossed his face. "Not a thing I would insult you by counterfeiting." It should have offended her. Instead, the terrible honesty of it entered cleanly. He did not flatter. He did not pretend sudden devotion. He offered no romance in advance. What he offered was shelter against financial ruin, protection against a cousin's scheme, and the use of his name in a society that respected names more than truth. "I would require terms," Corenza said. That was the first moment his attention sharpened with something like respect. "Name them." "If I marry you, my father's debts tied to Mercer are settled lawfully, not hidden. My mother remains provided for should my father's health fail. No one in your house is permitted to treat me as purchased gratitude. And if your cousin, your former suitor, or any other soul uses my name as a shield for their own designs, I am told the truth at once." Nathaniel considered only briefly. "Agreed." She added, more quietly, "And I will not be made to live beside a ghost." This time he did not answer at once. "My house has had enough of the dead," he said at last. It was not tenderness, but it was something honest enough to stand in its place. 3 days later, Williamsburg learned that Miss Corenza Ashford, lately so unfortunate, had become engaged to Mr. Nathaniel Ashworth of Ashworth Landing. The colony reacted exactly as colonies do when denied the downfall they had already rehearsed in private. Surprise, curiosity, admiration disguised as concern, malice repacked as worldly skepticism. Some said Nathaniel had acted from family duty. Some said from pride. Some said no woman would willingly bind herself to a man so cold unless the alternative were debtor's prison by way of social burial. Miss Lavinia Vane did not say anything aloud at first. That made her more dangerous. The wedding took place within a fortnight at St. Anne's, with restraint rather than celebration. Corenza wore ivory silk, altered from her mother's gown. Nathaniel stood beside her with the grave stillness of a man signing not away his freedom, but deeper into duty. When he took her hand, the pressure was careful, almost formal. No one looking at them would have mistaken it for passion. No one looking closely would have mistaken it for contempt either. Ashworth Landing stood broad and handsome above the river, its brick facade stern rather than ornamental, its rooms filled with old wood, disciplined order, and the sort of silence that seems less empty than watched. Nathaniel's household received her correctly. Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, bowed with measured approval. The steward was cautious but respectful. The servants studied her the way all servants must study any new mistress whose temper may alter the weather of a house. Only one person looked at her as if she were an intrusion wrapped in lace. Silas Ashworth arrived the second evening after her wedding. He was handsome in the bright, polished fashion of men who mistake ease for consequence. Lighter-haired than Nathaniel, softer at the mouth, quicker to smile, and much less safe. He kissed Corenza's hand too long. "My dear cousin has moved with astonishing speed," he said. One might almost admire it if admiration did not arrive so burdened with questions. Nathaniel, standing at the hearth, did not raise his voice. "Then carry your questions elsewhere." Silas only smiled. "I should be sorry to offend our new lady, particularly when she has come to us under circumstances so delicate." Corenza had spent too many weeks being spoken around. She met his eyes and said, "I have found delicacy most often in the mouths of those preparing to do something coarse." For the first time, Nathaniel looked at her not as a duty assumed, but as a mind entering the room. Silas laughed, though his eyes chilled. "We shall all get on famously." They would not. Married life at first was not unhappy. It was exact. Nathaniel gave her every outward respect, all practical authority, and room enough to move through the house without feeling surveilled. He asked her preferences at table, deferred to her arrangements in the drawing room, made certain the legal settlements promised to her family were executed properly, and never once reached for familiarity she had not offered. Yet the very courtesy that protected her also kept him distant. Their conversations were intelligent, often unexpectedly so, but carefully bounded. He slept in the chamber adjoining hers, though a communicating door remained between them like a sentence neither had decided how to finish. Corenza told herself this was best. She had not married for romance. He had not claimed to offer it. Still, human hearts are not made reasonable merely because terms are written clearly. As the London fashions of the season arrived late in trunks and gossip from England passed through the governor's circles, Williamsburg prepared its own spring assemblies, suppers, and card evenings. Corenza entered society again not as a diminished fiancé, but as Mrs. Ashworth. It altered everything and almost nothing. Doors reopened, so did eyes. At Mrs. Harbury's musicale, she heard one lady murmur that some women recovered from mourning with remarkable speed when a large estate was available. At a supper near College Creek, another observed that practical marriages often ripened into affection if the wife remained grateful and discreet. The insult beneath such remarks was always the same, that Corenza had traded sentiment for security, and ought therefore to accept condescension as part of the bargain. For a time she endured it, as she had endured so much before. Then, one night at Ashworth Landing, while reviewing household accounts by candlelight, she noticed a payment entered twice under two different abbreviations. The amounts were small. The dates were not. The duplicate disbursements aligned with messages sent to town on evenings when Silas had appeared uninvited the next day, armed with knowledge he ought not to possess. She brought the ledger to Nathaniel's study. He looked up from a packet of correspondence, saw the page she had marked, and frowned. "Where did you find this?" "In your own accounts," she said. "Which is less comforting than it should be." Nathaniel crossed to her side. Their shoulders nearly touched as he bent over the ledger. The scent of ink, candle wax, and the cold night air still clinging to his coat settled between them. "These sums went through Carter," he said. "The understeward?" "Yes. He is selling information." Nathaniel turned a page. "Or being paid to forget what should be his duty." Corenza rested one finger on the margin. "Either way, your cousin is not guessing." He was silent a moment. Then, "I should have seen this earlier." She surprised herself by answering gently. "You were watching larger threats. Men often miss the small doors through which danger prefers to enter." His mouth changed, not into a smile but into something warmer than reserve. "And women do not?" "We are taught to live beside small dangers until they become a science." From that evening, their marriage shifted. Not outwardly. Society still saw the same grave husband and elegant wife moving through rooms with measured harmony. But inside the house, a different alliance began to form. Nathaniel showed her the older Ashworth papers concerning his father's death, the disputed storage rights, and a chain of contracts so tangled that only greed could have designed them comfortably. Corenza read them with the patience of someone who had learned at last that confusion is often a costume worn by theft. Nathaniel's father, Tobias Ashworth, had died after falling from a riverside stair during a storm 2 years earlier. The death had been ruled accidental. Yet certain signatures, executed in the week before and after his burial, had always troubled Nathaniel. They enlarged Silas's oversight claims, weakened the estate's hold over a profitable set of warehouses, and allowed outside partners, including Edmund Mercer, to circulate obligations under Ashworth influence without direct Ashworth consent. "Did you ever believe your father was murdered?" Corenza asked quietly. Nathaniel stared at the fire before answering. "I believed someone profited too neatly from his death." "Those are not always different things." He looked at her then with a stillness that felt like trust. So they began, together, to investigate what polite society preferred left buried. Corenza wrote notes in a narrow, disciplined hand and kept them between sheets of devotional essays no one in the house would disturb. She questioned Mrs. Bell casually about the old household staff. She learned which dockman drank too freely when ashamed, which clerk suddenly acquired a better horse after Tobias Ashworth died, and which attorney's nephew had once carried sealed packets for Silas at unseasonable hours. Nathaniel, for his part, pressed men who feared only legal consequence, compared warehouse tallies, and followed a chain of river payments leading toward a merchant syndicate that had used Mercer as an agreeable fool and hoped to use the Ashfords as collateral debris. The more Corenza learned, the less passive grief remained in her. She had thought marriage to Nathaniel would require self-erasure in a finer house. Instead, it required that she become sharper, steadier, and less willing to call silence virtue. That change did not please everyone. Miss Lavinia Vane returned to the field in June. She came first in satin and civility, calling at Ashworth Landing on a warm afternoon with peaches for Mrs. Bell and a story about her aunt's health. Lavinia was beautiful in the finished way of women who have been praised too long not to expect the world to answer back in admiration. She wore disappointment elegantly, which made it harder for fools to identify as poison what was merely patience dressed in lace. "My dear Mrs. Ashworth," she said, accepting tea beneath the gallery windows, "you must find the river air improving. There is a sort of peace here one could almost mistake for happiness." "I have found peace often mistaken," Corenza replied. Lavinia's lashes lowered. "How fortunate you are, then, to learn so quickly." Nathaniel entered not long after and gave Lavinia every courtesy due an old acquaintance, and not one shade more. Corenza noticed the difference because she had learned his economies. Lavinia noticed it too. Within a week, whispers began again. This time they were subtler. Corenza heard that Nathaniel had once all but promised himself to Miss Vane before the Ashford calamity made a convenient rescue marriage more advantageous. She heard that Lavinia knew too much of Nathaniel's private affairs to be discarded quietly. She heard, most dangerously, that certain letters existed proving Corenza's marriage had not only been strategic, but built upon deceptions regarding Mercer's debts and Tobias Ashworth's final papers. When such rumors reached Corenza, old instincts urged endurance. Newer instincts told her that endurance without inquiry was merely surrender wearing moral ribbons. So she went not to her room, but to Nathaniel. "Tell me the truth about Miss Vane," she said that evening in his study. He set down his pen at once. "I intended to. That would have been wiser yesterday." A shadow of regret moved through him. "You are right." He stood at the window a moment, then turned back. "Lavinia and our families expected a match. I considered it once. I never offered what she later claimed to possess, but I was not careful enough with her hopes. After my father died, she wished the marriage settled quickly. I would not do it while the estate stood on uncertain ground. She took refusal as humiliation. And now? Now she would like to punish me by making my marriage appear fraudulent and my wife unwelcome." Corenza heard the last word more than the rest. My wife, not the Ashford daughter, not the woman under his name. My wife. Does she have letters? A few. Nothing compromising in itself. Enough, perhaps, to be arranged beside lies. Corenza moved nearer the hearth. "Then that is what she means to do." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I can stop her." "With threats?" "With law, if needed." She shook her head slowly. Men always think force ends a woman's malice. Often, it only teaches her to choose a better hour. He regarded her with that grave attention she had begun to understand as the beginning of reliance. "What do you suggest?" Corenza thought of Lavinia's beauty, her thwarted pride, and the social appetite for stories in which a lawful wife is merely a successful intruder. "I suggest," she said, "that we discover her hour before she strikes it." They did not have long to wait. The summer assembly at the governor's palace brought together nearly everyone whose opinion could still bruise a life in Virginia. Candlelight poured over polished floors, military cloth, silks, ribbons, and carefully arranged smiles. Music moved through the rooms with that false lightness under which ambitious people sharpened their knives. Corenza wore deep blue silk with no unnecessary ornament. Nathaniel stood beside her in black and ivory, severe as ever and, to her eye, far less cold than he believed himself to appear. For the first hour, nothing happened, which was how Corenza knew something would. At last, Lavinia approached with two ladies, one colonel's wife, and the sort of expression women use when preparing to wound under the seal of feminine concern. "My dear Mrs. Ashworth," she said softly, "I fear something has been put into my hands that I would never willingly circulate. Yet if a lady's good name is being used by gentlemen for purposes beyond her knowledge, can one remain silent?" Nearby conversation faltered. Nathaniel's body hardened beside Corenza, though he had not yet moved. Corenza looked at Lavinia's gloved hand. A folded packet rested there. "Silence," Corenza said, "has many uses, Miss Vane. In your case, I had not thought mercy among them." Lavinia colored but pressed on. "These letters suggest that Mr. Ashworth's marriage was resolved not from affection nor even duty, but from necessity arising out of older entanglements and irregular papers connected to his father's estate. I should be ashamed to wound you, madam, but I should be more ashamed to see you deceived." There it was. Not an accusation against Nathaniel alone, an invitation for Corenza to feel publicly displaced inside her own marriage. For one violent instant, humiliation rose so fast she nearly tasted it. The room, the lights, Lavinia's face, the small, hungry turn of several listeners, all of it pressed against an older fear. That she had indeed been admitted only by necessity and might yet be dismissed by the same law. Nathaniel stepped forward. "This ends now." Corenza touched his sleeve. He stopped. The gesture was small. It changed everything. Months earlier, perhaps even weeks, she would have yielded the field to him and called the yielding gratitude. But she had not traced ledgers, followed servants' silences, watched greed wear perfume, and learned the shape of her own mind merely to stand quiet while another woman used her heart as a stage. "Miss Vane," Corenza said, her voice level though her pulse struck hard. "If you mean to wound me plainly. If you mean to protect me, begin by showing whose hand gave you those papers." A hush widened. Lavinia hesitated, only for a second, but hesitation in public is blood in water. "I received them anonymously." "How convenient," Corenza said. "And yet the anonymous in Virginia often wear a family resemblance." She turned, not to Nathaniel, but to Mrs. Bird, an older widow whose brother had once served on the colony's legal council and whose chief pleasure was fairness, when fairness promised drama. "Madam," Corenza said, "since my marriage has become tonight's entertainment, allow me the discourtesy of making the whole amusement complete." From her reticule she drew not one paper, but three. The first was a copy of a note carried weeks earlier by Carter, the dismissed understeward, linking Silas Ashworth to payments for household information. The second was an account extract showing renewed pressure on Mercer-linked obligations at moments corresponding with Lavinia's renewed appearances. The third was a witness statement obtained that very morning from a riverman who had seen Tobias Ashworth quarrel with Silas on the riverside stair on the night before Tobias died. She handed them first to Mrs. Bird, then to a judge's wife, then, at last, to Nathaniel, because she knew by then that evidence must travel through different kinds of credibility before truth can survive a room. "These letters," Corenza said, nodding toward Lavinia's packet, "may prove only that Mr. Ashworth once received attention from a lady determined to read promise into delay. But my papers prove something else, that efforts have been made for months to weaken this marriage, not because it is false, but because it stands between ambitious people and profitable theft. Lavinia's face drained. "You cannot know what you are saying." "I know enough." Corenza took one step nearer. "I know my late fiancé's debts were used to endanger my family. I know Mr. Ashworth's father died leaving behind altered advantages for his cousin. I know household information was sold. I know my name has been used repeatedly because some people believe a woman already acquainted with loss will endure any further insult in silence." Now she looked directly at Silas, who had gone still near the card-room doorway. "That," she said, "was your first mistake." The words landed clean. Nathaniel did not rescue her from the silence that followed. He stood beside her, not before her. Silas recovered enough to laugh once, though it sounded thin. "A most dramatic little tale, cousin. Are we to let ladies prosecute inheritance questions now?" Mrs. Bird, reading with evident delight, said dryly, "If gentlemen have managed them so profitably, perhaps we should." Several people laughed. Not many. Enough. Corenza went on. "Your second mistake was believing grief makes a woman blind. It may, for a time, but once it clears, she remembers every face that watched kindly while sharpening its own advantage." Lavinia drew breath to speak again, but Nathaniel at last entered the matter. When he did, his voice carried the whole iron structure of his restraint. He produced the original warehouse contracts, the disputed signature comparisons, and a sworn statement from an attorney who had long suspected coercion around the succession papers, but lacked a witness strong enough to survive family pressure. He named the merchants who stood to benefit if Corenza were discredited and the Ashworth marriage made to look corrupt. He did not dramatize, he built. And because Corenza had spoken first, because she had named the pattern before he named the proof, the room understood the scale of the scheme in a different way. Not as a quarrel between men over property, but as a design that had depended for its safety upon humiliating a woman into stillness. The collapse began there. Lavinia denied knowledge, then denied intent, then denied interpretation. Silas called the witness drunk, the papers misread, the whole business sentimental invention fed by feminine nerves. That finished him more completely than any confession might have done. People stepped back. Judges do not enjoy being forced into action by drawing-room intrigue, but they enjoy less being made fools before witnesses whose gossip outruns their authority. By the following week, inquiries had begun. Carter confessed enough to save himself. The riverman repeated his story soberly before men who wished very much he would contradict himself. A clerk in Richmond produced copies of warehouse transfers that should never have passed so neatly through Silas's hands. It was never proved in a court that Silas pushed Tobias Ashworth to his death. It was proved, however, that he altered advantage around that death, manipulated subsequent claims, and conspired to weaken Nathaniel's hold over the estate through the circulation of compromised obligations and reputational attacks. In practical society, certainty of wickedness often matters less than sufficiency of proof. Silas lost his claims, his allies, and at last the confidence of those men who lend support only where scandal still promises profit. Lavinia fared differently. Society did not cast her out. Society rarely punishes beautiful women exactly as it threatens to. But the softness was gone from how people heard her. Her concern sounded chosen now, her sweetness rehearsed. For a woman who had lived by arranging belief, distrust was its own slow exile. Ashworth Landing grew quieter after that, though no longer cold. The first real change came not in public but in Corenza's own heart, and it came disguised as exhaustion. After weeks of pressure, she walked one evening to the riverside terrace and found herself suddenly unable to carry the last of her composure. Nathaniel followed only when she had already gripped the stone balustrade hard enough to hurt. "It is done," he said gently. "That is not why I am shaking." He waited. She stared out at the black water, taking the moon in broken pieces. "All this time I have been useful, alert, brave when required, and I have worn it like armor because armor is easier than fear. But I am tired, Nathaniel. I am tired of being the sensible woman in the room while people measure what can be taken from me. I am tired of thinking that if I weaken for 1 hour, I shall become helpless again." It was the most naked truth she had given him. She almost regretted it the moment it left her. Then Nathaniel said very quietly, "Must strength always look like concealment to you?" She turned toward him. He had come no closer than courtesy allowed. That, somehow, undid her more. "I do not know," she admitted. His face, usually so governed, held a sorrow not for himself, but for her. "Corenza, you saved your family, helped preserve my father's name from theft, and saw what half the men around us were too vain to notice. If you tremble now, it is not failure, it is cost." No one had ever named it so exactly. Something in her, held tight for months, loosened. She sat on the stone bench beneath the terrace wall and covered her face for only a moment, ashamed of tears even then. Nathaniel knelt before her, not grandly, not theatrically, simply because it placed him where she would not have to look up through distress. "I entered this marriage," he said, "believing I could offer protection, respect, and a fair name. I thought that would be enough, because they were the only things I trusted myself to promise. I did not understand that distance can wound almost as efficiently as cruelty when it is placed beside loyalty and called prudence." Her hands lowered slowly. "I never wished to burden you," she said. He gave one restrained, astonished breath. "And I never wished you to think your grief, your anger, or your fear must be hidden to deserve remaining here." There at last was the true danger between them. Not scandal, not law, not old lovers or cousins, but the fact that both had mistaken self-denial for honor. Corenza looked at him through the last of her tears. "When you first proposed, I thought I was entering a contract to prevent collapse." "You were?" "Yes," she whispered. "But somewhere in the middle of all this, I began to fear the ending of that contract more than I feared the gossip that began it." Nathaniel's expression changed with such quiet force that she felt it before she fully understood it. "There is no part of me," he said, "that wishes this marriage ended. Even now that it need not continue? Especially now." He took her hand then, not as a public gesture, not as form, but as a man asking to be believed without the safety of strategy. "I love you, Corenza." The words were simple. Because they were true, they struck deeper than ornament could have done. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "You have the most severe manner imaginable of declaring it. It is the only manner I possess. That is no longer true." For the first time since her wedding day, and indeed for the first time in all the months they had known each other, she touched his face of her own choosing. The reserve there did not vanish. It opened. "I love you too," she said. "Not because you saved me, because you saw me becoming someone I had not yet learned to trust, and when the hour came, you stood beside that woman instead of in her place." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly against her hand. The river moved below them, broad and dark and living. By autumn, when the inquiries were concluded and the estate secured fully under Nathaniel's name, Ashworth Landing no longer felt like a fortress arranged against intrusion. It felt inhabited. Corenza oversaw the house not as a grateful dependent, but as its mistress in truth. She restructured accounts, dismissed two men whose loyalty bent too easily toward higher bidders, and reopened the schoolroom allowance Tobias Ashworth had once funded for tenants' daughters before Silas quietly ended it. Nathaniel listened when she spoke of money, labor, and reputation, not because he loved her and wished to please her, but because experience had taught him that her judgment improved whatever it touched. The Ashfords, though never grand again, lived securely. Her father carried his embarrassment with better humility. Her mother came often to the river and ceased apologizing for accepting comfort from the daughter she had once feared disgraced. As for society, it did what society always does after nearly destroying someone unjustly. It remembered only fragments of its own appetite. People said Mrs. Ashworth had shown uncommon steadiness. They said Mr. Ashworth had chosen wisely. They said Silas had always had too much polish to be safe. They even said Miss Vane had been unfortunate in the violence of her feelings. Corenza no longer cared very much what they said. She had learned that dignity alone is too passive a shield. Dignity, sharpened by truth and joined to action, is another thing entirely. On the anniversary of their marriage, Nathaniel brought her not jewels, though he could have done so, but a small packet of recovered papers. The last Mercer obligations canceled in full, the Ashford name cleared where law could clear it, and Tobias Ashworth's original charitable endowment, restored under both their signatures. "You give unusual gifts," she said. "I am told romance improves with practice." She laughed then, freely, and the sound transformed the room more completely than any music at the palace ever had. Later that evening, standing with him in the long western gallery while candlelight warmed the polished floor and the river lay silver beyond the windows, Corenza understood at last what had changed most. She had entered Ashworth Landing believing survival required self-sacrifice, concealment, and the endurance of whatever terms stronger people set. She remained there because she had learned another law. A woman is never safer for making herself smaller. She is safest when truth no longer frightens her into silence, when grief no longer teaches obedience, and when love, at last, is built not on rescue or debt, but on the grave and tender honor of being fully seen.